Good morning, all. This broadcast is going out on YouTube Live and also on Facebook in our group, Ketonic Revolution. I provided a link to the YouTube channel because that was the easiest thing to do as far as the biggest reach. So if you're listening to me right now, you want to go to our YouTube channel. Well, I guess you wouldn't be listening to me right now if you're not there. So in any case, you can go to the YouTube channel and find us live there or in Ketonic Revolution if you happen to be listening. My guest is not with us yet. Her name is Tamzyn Murphy from Nutrition Network. Not only was she a mentor of mine because I've done a large number of certifications through the Nutrition Network in the area of low carbohydrate. Hold on a minute, because Tamzyn's here now. Good morning. How are you?
Hi, Pete. I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate so much that you've taken the time to join us. I was just explaining to our viewers what we're doing today. So give me a minute, and I'll be back with you in a second.
No problem.
And thanks again for being here, because I know I have a sense for how busy you are. I am too, and I will be very respectful of your time this morning. Don't worry about that. So as I'm telling my viewers, we have Tamzyn Murphy with us today. She's one of the top nutritionists in the area of low carb, high fat lifestyles, the ketogenic diet in the world. And what I'm hoping today is that we can talk about the role of carbs in humans to start with, because I have found in my own practice that this is just and I know I'm going to be passionate about this, but this is just an ongoing argument. It seems every single time I have a conversation with anyone, whether it's an extended family member or a potential client who my daughter and I are helping to reverse diabetes, or they're trying to do weight loss because they're significantly overweight, or they're trying to improve their cardiovascular condition. And I'm not going to lie, it's a frustration. So with me, because I think there's a general idea out there that carbs are essential to humans. And in fact, I've even run up against some nutritionists here in the United States that have even angrily pointed out to me that we can't exist on the planet without them. So I wanted to start there with Tamzyn, and then gently move towards the issue of athleticism. And where that comes into play is that there's, I think, a lot of people like me, and I reversed diabetes 2 years ago, who are athletes. And again, this issue of carbs just keeps coming back. I've had trainers tell me you can't do strength training without carbs on the ketogenic diet. You can't do HIIT exercises. It's just impossible to do anything athletic outside of endurance. And even in that, I've had trainers say that they think that all of that research is just plain malarkey. So I don't know, with that introduction, if I missed something about your background, Tamzyn, just feel free to tell the viewers what your background is, and then if we could start with the premise that carbs are essential for human existence, what your feelings are about that.
Awesome. So let me start by just saying thank you so much for having me here on your show. It's really a privilege and an honor with all the great work that you do and your daughter does, and all the changes in your own health as well. So I'm really privileged and happy to be here. Thank you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I'm a dietitian. I'm based in South Africa. And I work for a training platform called the Nutrition Network, where we train doctors and dietitians and nurses and health coaches on using therapeutic carbohydrate restriction for its various evidence-based applications. I also have got a clinical practice called Real Food Dietitians, where I see clients along with a colleague of mine, another lead in low carb nutrition from a dietitian perspective, because the dietitians seem to be one of the slowest adopters of low carb nutrition. But Bridget Surtees and myself were the two first low carb dietitians in South Africa, so we're very proud of that. So that's kind of my background. So looking at I also want to just apologize if my computer sounds like it's about to take off. I have unfortunately got quite an old computer, and so you've just got to pretend we're on an airline together and we're having a nice discussion in a private jet, and then I'm sure you'll feel more comfortable with my overactive fan. All right, moving swiftly along. So are carbohydrates essential? No, they are the only of the three macronutrients, if we're not counting alcohol, because obviously that's not essential either, but of carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Carbohydrates is the only one that is not essential. Our bodies can make it. We know that that we need to get fat and protein from the diet, especially the 9 essential amino acids, especially the essential fatty acids. We need to be getting that from the diet. Other fats are also necessary from the diet in order to fulfill our energy requirements, our energy needs. But carbohydrates are not. We can make them and we can be perfectly healthy. And that is very, very evident if we look back to traditional societies who haven't eaten carbohydrates for extended periods of time. We can look at the Inuit, the Eskimos. And, we know from Stefansson's research in his books as an anthropologist who ended up living with the Eskimos and Inuit, for 8 months of the year, they ate no carbs. There's nothing growing in amongst the snow there, So basically they're living off seafood, seals, blubber, liver, that sort of thing. And he was healthier than he had ever been before. We've got other examples where carbohydrates, there's some carbohydrates being consumed, like in the Maasai, but it's very low. It's mainly traditionally it was from the milk, blood, meat that they were eating. Now, unfortunately, with modernization and less of a nomadic kind of lifestyle, more of a settled kind of lifestyle, more influence from westernized culture, there's a lot of more carbs that are actually included nowadays. But traditionally, there's a whole lot of societies that kind of show us that carbohydrates are not essential. We can make them, and we know that. We know that carbohydrates are made via a process of gluconeogenesis. We know that they also can be stored for use later in the form of glycogen. So really, it's not, that's not even controversial.
So I know that when I started the ketogenic diet, I went through a couple of months where, I'm a CrossFit athlete, and back then I was still going to the CrossFit gym. Now I do my own thing. I'm a trainer and I do my own programming. But I can remember going to the CrossFit gym the first couple of months that I was on the ketogenic diet, and just having, it was hard to work out. I did the workouts just because I was, it was willpower. I've been a climber and a mountaineer for most of my life, so I know about like just pushing through barriers, right? I understood at the time that I was in the process of getting keto adapted. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of people who kind of are resistant to doing their homework before they start this lifestyle, I don't know how often I've heard that, okay, I started the keto diet this week and I went to do a workout and I'm dying. Enough of the keto. I'm not doing it anymore, right? So can you talk about what's going on with the keto adaptation, why people feel that way in the beginning, and then eventually after a few months and there's adaptation, where that sensation that you just are not able to pick up a weight or run, for 200 meters or something? What is going on with that?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there's various things that are going on. So the first thing is that you are obviously, it's called keto adaptation or fat adaptation. because you are adapting, which implies a change of environment, right? So when you adapt, you're going from one environment to another. In this case, you're going from primarily burning carbs as fuel, glucose as fuel, to primarily burning fat as a fuel. And ketones may be high as well, so you may be burning ketones, especially in the brain or in other areas. But you're primarily burning fat as a fuel. And so that changeover is nothing to be shrugged off. It's quite a major structural overhaul if you think of it from a cellular level. Your cells have been given a whole lot of glucose, and they have to use that first, because high blood glucose levels, over a chronic period of time is called diabetes. No one wants to end up with diabetes. So your body's not going to let that happen if it can help it. And it's going to tell you to burn the glucose first whenever that's in your bloodstream, which means all the processes required for burning glucose are going to be upregulated. The proteins that are required for signaling, insulin signaling, the downstream signaling pathways, all the little proteins, enzymes that are required along that pathway, it's all going to be, there's going to be more of it. It's kind of like a factory that's job is to make chocolate. It's going to have chocolate making machines. Similarly, your cells are a factory whose job is to burn carbs, because that's what the input is. So you're going to have a lot of carb burning machinery. It's going to be optimized for that. Now suddenly you stop eating carbs, or you're not going to completely stop eating them, because you're still going to even find carbs in like muscle meat, But generally you're going down to a very low carb intake. You're reducing your carbs substantially. Now there's not enough to fuel your body alone. And that's fine, because there's still enough carbs your body can make for your brain, together with the ketones, which your brain can use. And there's enough fat to use. Most of us, all of us, even the skinniest of us, generally have enough fat to use as fuel in our stores. And so now we have to learn to use that. And we're also eating more in our diet. That requires a structural overhaul. So now we're telling our chocolate making factories to become cheese making factories, let's say. So suddenly you're going to need a whole lot of different machinery to what you had at the chocolate making factory. You're also going to have to train staff or change staff for an expertise that is more into making cheese than it would be into making chocolate. And the same thing actually applies in the cells. You're changing enzymes, you're changing proteins, you're changing signaling pathways, you're upregulating certain aspects of metabolism over others. So it is a changeover, and that process takes time. Another thing that happens is that there's in that regard, you're not able to efficiently burn the fuel that your body is now available to your body. And one of the things that actually happens when you go low carb is an enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase, which is really important in glycolysis, which is the primarily anaerobic, so not requiring oxygen really, process of burning glucose. Glycolysis is not something that happens when you're burning fat. So this, you no longer really need much pyruvate dehydrogenase, and so there's a down regulation, there's less pyruvate dehydrogenase. But now you're not able to burn carbs so well, but you're also not particularly good at burning fat yet either. So it's this changeover period that can be kind of pesky from ensuring that you have enough fuel kind of perspective, because exercise is a high fuel demand environment. So your muscle cells are needing more than they would at rest. And so the demand is high. But if you can't just tick over using fat because you are not adapted to it yet, there's going to be a period of reduction in performance. It's going to happen. So there's that. But then there is also a change in electrolyte balance. So when you're eating plenty of carbs, then your insulin goes up. Insulin has to go up because remember, you don't want to become diabetic. So this is your way of your body basically getting the blood sugar or the glucose out of your bloodstream and into the cells so that you don't become diabetic, so your blood glucose doesn't go up. So insulin is going to be chronically high if you're eating like 6 meals a day. 3 meals a day, 3 snacks a day, mainly with lots of carbs. And your insulin's always going to be up because you're always putting in carbs. You always have glucose in your bloodstream that needs to be taken out and put into the cells. Now, insulin doesn't just take glucose out of the bloodstream and put it into the cells. it also works at the level of the kidneys. What insulin does at the level of the kidneys is it holds onto sodium, onto salt, and it also holds onto fluid. So when you're eating carbs, you generally will find that you may even have higher blood pressure because that fluid and salt often increases circulating blood volume as well. So you end up with slightly higher blood pressure. And then you go low carb. You're eating less frequently. You're eating a lot less carbs. Your blood glucose isn't rising much, so there's not much insulin being produced anymore because it doesn't have to be taking the glucose out of the bloodstream, putting it into the cells, but that has an effect on the kidneys. At the level of the kidneys, low insulin is saying, let's wee out salt. Let's wee out the fluid as well. So you get a reduction in circulating blood volume. And you get basically a natriuresis of fasting is what it's called. But it's also in athletes, it's even more concerning because athletes already often end up low in sodium because of the losses during exercise. So now you're having further losses in your urine. You have reduction in circulating blood volume, which means that you're going to get lightheaded, have less energy, because basically it's kind of like being dehydrated. It's a form of dehydration. So your blood isn't able to flow around with as much pressure anymore. Therefore, whatever the blood has in it that's supplying your cells, whether that's air or whether that's nutrients, it's a bit sluggish. It's not getting around to your cells as quickly. You might find that you have orthostatic hypotension. When you stand up, you feel a bit dizzy. You start to get fatigued, especially in the afternoon. You start to get headaches. You have drops in energy, definitely. And that's going to affect your exercise, your willingness to even go exercise, as well as when you are exercising, it's going to affect you as well. And then if you allow that to carry on, then what happens is you don't have very much sodium to lose anymore hanging around in your bloodstream or whatever. So the sodium is kind of now the sodium that you do have is now sitting mainly in your cells. So your cells start to give up their sodium, which then get excreted in the urine. Now that can only happen up to a point because cells need sodium. Sodium potassium pumps and stuff and maintaining potential differences across membranes and making sure cells work properly, they really, really, really need salt. They really need sodium. So what the cells then do is they kind of find their designated doppelganger, if you want to call it that, for sodium. So it's kind of like, oh, who else around here is a positively charged ion? Oh, potassium, magnesium. Why don't you guys go rather? And we'll hold on to our sodium because it's kind of in scarce supply at the moment. So the cells start losing other positively charged ions, specifically electrolytes, specifically magnesium and potassium. So after long enough of losing the sodium, the cell says, this far and no further. And then it starts giving up its potassium and magnesium, and you start weeing that out. And I just need to tell my daughter that she must go to her friend. Hannah, you must go. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay, so the magnesium and the potassium start being lost. Magnesium and potassium, as someone who's big into exercise, an athlete knows how important those are, right? Because in all those electrolyte solutions and sport drinks, you're replacing sodium, but you're also replacing potassium and magnesium. They're really important for the muscle. They're really important for muscle signaling. They're really important for muscle contraction. Now, if you're losing those, you start getting muscle spasms, you start getting muscle aches and pains, and you start getting muscle fatigue. Another problem is that the loss of magnesium causes insomnia and anxiety as well. So that's really something to note. And then something I forgot to mention back with when sodium was the only one being lost is that this dehydration is also probably can cause constipation as well. So you start finding that you have less. I'm sorry about the sound.
It's okay.
You have less bowel movements going on, and so it's just a general discomfort. So not only are you finding that you're having a reduction in your performance because of you trying to go this changeover from carbohydrates to fat utilization being suboptimal because you're turning your factory from chocolate making factories into cheese factories, you're also now having this loss of electrolytes, which specifically impact on your muscle function and on your energy levels. So you're feeling really, really rubbish. So what do you do about this? I think that would be the next question. Would you like me to go there, or did you want to explore what we've spoken about so far a bit more before we find out what we can do to combat this?
No, because our time is precious. What you just explained, though, was perfect, because people need to understand that if they're going to shift into this lifestyle, that they need to prepare for it. They need to understand that they should be intaking electrolytes at the beginning and not waiting, right? They can push off this whole concept of the keto flu. And like in my case, I knew I was expecting to have issues working out, and I did. And for me, there's two parts to it, right? Part of it was reversing the diabetes and being committed to this lifestyle. And the other part of it was the scientist in me wanting to experience exactly what you go through. So what you explained is really, really good. And I hope that the viewers that are listening about this understand that this is a lifestyle coming in, and there are profound changes that happen in your body. And it takes time to get keto adapted. And I'm in my 60s. I'm going to be 63 in just a couple of weeks. And
wow, happy birthday. And look at you. You look very fit. So there's an advertisement for the keto lifestyle right there.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I work really hard at trying to be fit, because I want to be around for the next 20 or 30 years to enjoy life with my wife. But also see my daughter eventually, have grandchildren, be able to go climbing with those kids and things, even in my 80s. So this has been very important to me, but also when I work with my clients and they're asking about these questions, because, and I don't want to, I'm going to come back with more questions to you. So I don't want to go on too long, but it's important for people to realize, maybe some people that are just stumbling onto this, that what keto isn't, we're not a pill. You're not taking a pill and then having this black and white change that happens overnight. It's a change in lifestyle, and it takes time, because there are major changes that happen in our body. In terms of the athleticism, I think that the early data coming from Volek and Finning had to do with endurance races, and recently on our show here, we spoke with Andrei Obradovic, who I know that you know. Both you and he, if I forgot to say something, have been mentors of mine because of all the work that I've done with Nutrition Network, and he's an endurance athlete. So I think where I would like to go next with this is to hear from you about, because I know that you've worked with athletes, and eventually where I want to get with this is to the issue of carbs, right? And then walking towards the issue of the strength training and the HIIT, right? Because that's really controversial. But I know that you've worked with people, and some of your athletes, they add carbs into their diet, and some of them don't. I would like to hear what your rationale is with this, and on a personal level too, like not as somebody who's working with a client, right, who's adamant that they need to add some carbs, but what you think also about this necessity, because I know that some of these endurance racers are not using, like Andre doesn't. He the last time I had a discussion with him, he said that the latest marathon or whatever heinous thing that he did, all he had to do was drink water for the whole thing, and he didn't have to have any additional carbs. So anyway, what do you know about this?
Yeah, so I think you've summed it up quite succinctly by saying that there's different opinions on it, and there's also individuality. I think you hinted towards that a little bit. So I think the first thing to bear in mind is what kind of sport. Are we talking about endurance, or are we talking about like high intensity? And there are differences in that regard. And then also, how long has the person been fat adapted for? Because that plays a big role.
Right.
So with endurance, generally, short-term studies show that, low carb is going to impair performance. People are going to be burning more fat quite early on, but low carb is going to impair performance in the first 7 days, in the first 2 weeks. But thereafter, low carb, especially after 3 weeks, 4 weeks or longer, low carb is probably, after 3 months, it always shows pretty much an improvement in performance. Also because it's also just an improvement in the way you can exercise without all these goos and sports drinks and all these, you can run and win the 100-mile sky run, which has been won twice by a keto athlete. You can keep going, like you said, like Andre does, without anything but a bit of, electrolyte replacement and fluid. Because basically we know that fat burning is an oxidate. It's an oxygen requiring process, an aerobic process. So as long as you're consistently putting out like a VO2 max of 65, no one's going to say, oh, well, you know what, you can burn fat at that level. That's fine. So there's no real surprise that low carb could be beneficial for endurance athletes who are putting out at a certain lowish to high moderate rate for an extended period of time. They can draw on their fat stores. They don't have to rely so heavily on exogenous fuels. So there's no surprise there. The surprise comes in when they go above 65% VO2 max. Then, you would expect the crossover to happen and them to start relying much more heavily on carbs via glycolysis, which is an anaerobic process of providing energy, which we spoke about, which we know in low carb is downregulated. The pyruvate dehydrogenase for that is downregulated. So obviously you're expected to be worse at that when you're low carbing. And so when you go, you start doing high intensity stuff, you expect a deleterious effect on performance. Now, interestingly, Volek et al. We rely very heavily on a lot of their studies for the exercise kind of stuff, but they clearly found that there is fat burning happening in people up to 85% VO2 max. So people are able to, if they're fat adapted, if they've been low carbing for extended periods of time, like 9 months, they can actually exert a much higher energy output than would ever have been anticipated and was supposed to be a fact. We always thought that, the crossover happens at around 60-65% VO2 max, but that's because we were testing it. It was tested on people who were not fat adapted, who were burning carbs. They were carb adapted. Now we know that you can get to a much higher energy output, much higher power output, where you would expect to go into anaerobic metabolism, rely more heavily on glycolysis, and actually still be able to rely on your fat as a fuel source to a much higher point. Also, what's interesting is in the FASTER study by Volek et al. As well, they found that glycogen stores are quite well preserved. I apologize for my dogs.
No, don't worry about it.
Glycogen stores are quite well preserved in the muscles of fat adapted people. And so you kind of are saving that for when you really, really need it as well. So it shows a certain degree of metabolic flexibility that fat adapted athletes actually can go over to using carbs when they need to. Despite this downregulation of pyruvate dehydrogenase, probably because they have trained their body and just adapted to burning carbs when they need it. And I'm not sure exactly how the physiology of that works, but from the output, it's pretty clear that people who are doing high intensity interval training, who are doing weightlifting and that sort of thing that requires very maximal kind of power output in short bursts, seem to be able to even keto sometimes, but definitely low carb. So yeah, you said that you're even one of them. So But now, do you think that that applies to everyone? Because that I'm not sure about. And for those people who it doesn't apply to, I think, and even when it comes to endurance athletes, I think that there is a place for carbs, because I think there is individual variation. And I'm getting a bit carried away because I was going to ask you. So let's come back to my thoughts about individual variation, or where carbs have got a place for the low carb athlete in some cases. And I think that's important. Some people don't seem to need anything. They can run on fat, and they can do it at really quite high intensities, and they can definitely do it in endurance. But when it comes to optimizing performance, sometimes in race situations or in event situations, sometimes they can get that little extra performance benefit by providing a little bit of exogenous carbohydrates as a supplement, in a way, after like an hour or so of exercise. But that's not the case for everyone. And it would be, maybe you keep it for an event, or maybe you keep it for your really long events if you're an endurance athlete, or maybe there is a place for it for some people who are doing high power, high intensity kind of things as well. So I think there's individual variation. But you wanted to, I was interested in your story as well.
So because I'm holding back a little bit, because one of my interests with Andre is trying to understand how to help people, besides the fact that I health coach people in regard to the ketogenic diet. I'm also concerned with, the movement issue, like how much should a person be training? What should they be doing in all this? And then I have myself, which I consider kind of an enigma. And that mostly has to do with the fact that I've been a climber and a mountaineer most of my life. I took off about a decade or so, about 15 years, and now I've gotten back into it. But I've come from a culture, which is like, you would go out and you do these things, and sometimes the amount of effort that you had to put in was horrendous. Over 24 hours hammering and power endurance, and you got to do these things, because if you don't, you're going to possibly die. So real, very high intensity. Now that culture is still carried over for me. So I'm struggling right now at almost 63. How much should I be working out? Because my tendency is to go hard. Like yesterday, I did deadlifting. I've been working my strength back up. So I deadlifted 200 yesterday. If there's a weightlifter watching this right now, they're going to go, "Oh, come on, Dr. Pete, that's light." But like I said, I'm working back up. And then afterwards I did a HIIT, and I needed to. I just wanted to. I wanted to feel that intensity. And I think it comes from the mountaineering of looking at these big things. Now, I have to tell you that I have not felt. So I usually am working out like that 5 to 6 days a week, more or less. I've started to tone down because of my education through Andre. And try to allow more times for recovery. But I need to tell you, I have not experienced, I can get up today if I wanted. I already know this because I've been doing it. I could go out and do a similar workout again. And I know that since starting the ketogenic lifestyle, or once I've been keto adapted, at least as far as this has been 2 years now, that my recovery rate is better. I don't hit the wall. I've gone through some training with starting strength and with CrossFit, where you're with these guys for the entire weekend, and you're doing one workout after another, in the training, and having to hold these positions. And I notice the people around me are eating energy bars, and they're drinking energy drinks, and they're eating for the entire weekend. And I'm drinking water. And I bring my lunch, right? So that when we get a break midday, and I'm eating, keto food that I made the night before. So I know my carbs are really low, and with no problems whatsoever. So I have that experience. The reason that I'm really enjoying this conversation with you is because I find that the other side, if you will, is is very adamant, and there's an air of dismissal. Now, I err on your side, where I'm thinking, all right, people are individuals, and perhaps there is some carbohydrate fluctuation that's needed, and I can tell you one experience that I've had that's really caused me to question this. A few weeks ago, my wife and I, along with some friends, went into the Grand Canyon, and it's the first, backpacking trip, if you will, that we've done. And the route that we chose was not for the faint of heart. It was like one of the harder descents, like, several thousand feet within a short span of miles, and on the way in, and we had a young couple. Well, this part was kind of fun because we had a young couple that was in their 20s, or I think 20s. And one of the individuals was having a lot of difficulty. And so I did what I used to do as a mountain guide. I took her pack, and we took some of the things out of it, but I basically took her pack and threw it on top of mine. And I was carrying a load that was probably somewhere around 80 pounds, plus or minus. And then I took the pack all the way to where we were going to be camping. And I haven't done anything like that since I was in my, early 40s.
Wow. How are your joints?
Well, here's the thing. I was secretly also interested in what was going to happen to me, because it's like, okay, am I going to hit a wall here? Is there going to be anything? Am I going to just start? I mean, I'm in my 60s. I'm like, what's going to happen? Am I going to get another mile down this trail, another 1,000 feet of descent, and collapse and have to hand this pack off to someone else? And I had no such effects. I basically got that load all the way to where we were camping, but the following couple of days were really, really tough. I mean, I experienced muscle soreness on a level that, that I don't have this morning. And I did a really heavy duty workout yesterday. And then when we came time to come out of the canyon several days later, I think it was like 3 days later, I experienced, it was just willpower. I hammered to get out of there, and I did get out of there, right? There's no question that I would not have been able to get out of the canyon, but I was really struggling. And so, and that stimulated me to have this conversation with you, because it's like, maybe I needed some carbs. Maybe I went so hard to get that load down that I actually dug into my glycogen stores, because it's not really an endurance. That's not really an endurance thing. It's power endurance. You're having to move heavy weight up and down, and then go, for a ways. But so I know you're probably waiting for a question in here somewhere. And so
no. I've got lots of thoughts already going on. So, I'm thinking, yes, maybe you could have saved your muscle a certain amount if you had. It would have been really interesting if you had like 10 grams, 15 grams of carbs on hand and had it, and seen whether on an hour that you took in 10 to 15 grams of carbs, whether you felt more at ease, more comfortable than on an hour where you didn't have that. That would be interesting. But another thing is, that's a lot of weight for an extended period of time, and there's going to be damage happening. So I think that obviously your muscles didn't want to get you out of the canyon. You did it because you've got an incredibly strong mind, and because you've trained your mind, through the whole central governor model, that you can push yourself. But actually, your muscles were probably trying to repair themselves after some major damage. And so you were walking out of there with damaged muscles. Now, I have no doubt that you can recover just as easily on keto as you could, provided you are fat adapted, you are keto adapted as you are after 2 years. And I would say people are after 9 months as well. If you look at the FASTER study by Volek and Finney, which showed that glycogen repletion happens just as quickly on a keto diet, even if you don't eat carbs after exercise, those kind of things. So we know that recovery happens perfectly fine on keto. But I think it's just the sheer amount of stress you put your muscles and your joints under, honestly. But that brings me to another thought that I was having, which is, isn't it wonderful to know that you were eating probably an animal meat heavy kind of diet, which most keto is, like an animal food, a food-based diet, because then at least you're getting all the nutrients that are required to repair those muscles that you damaged, and the tendons potentially, and the ligaments that you potentially damaged as well. You know, collagen, all the right amino acids in the right proportions, all the things that we find in muscle meat. I mean, that's we're eating basically what you needed to replenish and you needed to fix after that, which is your muscle meat. You know, so you're providing it with all the building blocks that it needed in order to repair itself. And so I think it's just as well that you ate that way, because let's say you had been a vegan who wasn't getting the collagen, wasn't getting the essential amino acids all in the right proportions, did that kind of damage to their muscles, I would hypothesize that they would take a lot longer to recover.
I have, this is where, so here's the question, right? This is where this leads to. In the chat rooms and all this stuff, you know, I think one of the newest trends is to talk about metabolic flexibility. And it's getting me wild because, so here's how this ties in. If I can call myself this, a recovered diabetic, right? I reverse pre-diabetes. So what does that mean, right? And I'm working with clients who actually are really heavy duty type 2s, you know, and so I understand that globally, and I mean that in the sense of people, that carb intolerance is something that we have to think about. Some of us are carb intolerant, right? Now, I've been on the ketogenic diet for, you know, as we've said, for 2 years, and I know that I must have some carb intolerance. What is my level? I don't know, right? So,
and is it a problem provided you're not eating carbs?
Right.
Does it matter that you've got a peanut allergy if you don't eat peanuts? Does it matter that you're gluten intolerant if you don't eat gluten? Does it matter if you're carbohydrate intolerant if you're not eating the carbs? It would be a problem if you did an OGTT, an oral glucose tolerance test, and slugged down 75 to 100 grams of carbs of glucose in one sitting. Then yes, that would be a problem. But if you're not eating that level of carbs, then there's no opportunity for your body to exhibit its carbohydrate intolerance, to show itself. Because, yeah, so this is a good question. I think before we dive into it, I think we need to say, okay, what is carbohydrate intolerance? So people on a low carb diet do appear to develop what is called physiological or adaptive insulin resistance. So I recommend, if you feel like looking up a scientific article on this topic, which came out of my research team, actually, although I had left already by this stage, but look up Chris Webster and and Jamie Smith and Tertius Kuhn. So they did a paper on athletes on cyclists, showing that the cyclists are all very, very fit and healthy, a low carb group and not low carb group. And the low carb group scored really badly on an oral glucose tolerance test, which is supposedly the gold standard for diagnosing type 2 diabetes. Now, if we think back to what I said about our chocolate making factories versus cheese making factories, if you don't eat carbs, so you don't need a whole lot of carb processing machinery anymore. Just like you've changed from a chocolate making factory into a cheese making factory, you don't need the chocolate equipment anymore. Suddenly, a delivery vehicle comes with all this chocolate, you know, it's going to build up outside the factory doors, and, you know, a few of the old staff are going to be like taking a few pieces in, or, you know, or whatever, let's say bad example, but the raw ingredients to make chocolate, they're going to be taking it in and trying to use some of the cheese equipment to like make stuff with it. But the thing is, you're not optimized to that anymore. So if you suddenly go after eating 5 grams of carbs a day, 10 grams of carbs a day, 50 grams of carbs a day, and you suddenly piled on 100 grams of carbs all at once, you're not optimized to process that. So the carbs, the glucose will often hang around in your bloodstream for a longer period of time, and it can make you look like you are diabetic. but they've shown that that reverses in 3 days. So if you go back to eating a carb diet, it's an adaptive. It's a physiological insulin resistance. It isn't a pathological insulin resistance like type 2 diabetes would be or pre-diabetes would be. That is a pathological insulin resistance where you eat, a standard American diet and you go high blood glucose. That's a pathological insulin resistance because you should be optimized for burning that, right? But you're not optimized for burning it because you're getting high blood glucose readings. That is pathological. So that's something to think about. And that is where I don't think I don't like the whole idea of this carb cycling that people are into. They say, oh, you do keto and then you carb cycle, and then you eat fat and then you keto. Like, that's not going to work because you're either optimizing yourselves for one or the other. And if you go keto, you're going to be hanging out in that kind of that keto flu area that we were speaking about with the electrolyte imbalances and trying to optimize into making cheese factories. And then suddenly, you're changing over again, and then your blood pressure goes up and your electrolytes go up and your insulin goes up, and you're suddenly trying to make chocolate in your cheese factory, and then, you swap again just as you're optimizing that. So I don't like that. However, there is something that I must admit I just don't understand about the whole thing. And that is with carnivores. Interestingly, carnivores who are the most keto of ketos, right? Because they're eating under 5 grams of carbs a day, or about 5 grams of carbs a day, mainly in the form of the glycogen that's in the meat. Or if they include dairy, then it'll be a lot from dairy. And some people, include quite a bit of honey in their carnivore diets too. So I had a patient who had been carnivore for 2 years and put on a continuous glucose monitor and decided, I want to see what it's like when I eat 3 tablespoons of honey. So he eats 3 tablespoons of honey, barely a blip. He's hanging out at I suppose we work in different units, but like at 80 milligrams per deciliter, I think. He's hanging out kind of there and he doesn't rise. I'm gonna work in millimoles per liter because I don't know if I'm right in your milligrams per deciliter, but millimoles per liter, he's hanging out at around 4 millimoles per liter. And then he has 3 tablespoons of honey, which is 75 grams of carbs. And it blips to 4.2 millimoles per liter on his blood glucose. It's amazing. So that shows you some serious metabolic flexibility, in my opinion. And then at the end of the week, he's like, okay, well, let me have an almond flour-based pizza as my treat after my carnivore, So he has that. Maybe his blood glucose goes up to 4.5 millimoles per liter. I mean, that's still pretty low.
Amazing.
So that's amazing. Now, is it just him? I mean, this is an N of 1. Maybe other people wouldn't react that way. But if you look at people like Paul Saladino, the carnivore MD,
right.
He did a CGM experiment on himself as well. And also honey and those kind of things just made the smallest of blips. But yet we know that in keto, people who are doing keto, they do an OGTT, and that glucose raises their blood glucose very high, sometimes to diabetic levels. So that's something I'm trying to get my head around, and I don't have the answer. I don't think anyone else really does at this stage, but I would love to watch the space. Why is there a difference between keto, which is basically carnivore with low carb veg,
right,
and dairy maybe, versus carnivore, which is just minus the veg. Otherwise, it's much the same. Why would minus the veg potentially make you more metabolically flexible and able to use carbs better? I don't think that's necessarily bad. I don't think there's anything wrong with keto. I think keto, including the veg, is fine, but then you're not going to be wanting to eat those carbs on occasion because it seems that you will get this rise in blood glucose because you're not optimized to it. Why does that not seem to be the case in the few? Remember, these are healthy carnivores that I've seen examples of this in. So maybe if they went keto, they'd also be metabolically flexible, but I don't know, because I've seen OGTTs that are abnormal, like in the study I explained with the cyclists. Those cyclists are fit young men, but the OGTTs didn't look particularly good because they have this adaptive carbohydrate intolerance or insulin resistance. But carnivores somehow seem, at least in the N=1s that I've seen, seem to somehow circumvent that. And that is something that I'm completely stumped with. And I don't know. I don't know what's going on there, Dr. Pete. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, yeah, don't worry that you don't know on that. I mean, there's so much of this that that we're pushing up against, because I feel like the research for so long was delayed, right? I mean, we both know the history of the ketogenic lifestyle, and I guess the amount of resistance that has existed for whatever reason. So I feel like what we're talking about right now is something that I hope in the future is going to get pushed on, trying to understand more about the physiology. You're raising a really interesting point, because I've seen from time to time, one of the things that I've seen in myself, the longer that I've been keto adapted, and I am rigorous about this. I still am testing my blood, partly because I'm helping people too, and I don't want to ask my clients to do what I'm not willing to do. So I rigorously test my blood, and I still will. Like yesterday, I was testing all day long, because I think yesterday I experienced exactly what you're talking about here. I think that I had some elevated carbs, and in my fasting, and then my blood sugar. I'm using blood sugar because I'm so used to talking layman's terms now. But my blood glucose was higher than my average all day long, and that happens occasionally, but I've noticed that the longer that I've been keto adapted, that that my body's definitely continued to undergo changes. You know what I mean? And I'm wondering if maybe some of that isn't because the ectopic fat that I probably had around my pancreas and liver and all that when I went into this lifestyle has now been maybe even around the kidneys, has now ceased to exist, right? And I'm really super lean anymore. Like, I'm weight stable, but I'm super lean. And I'm wondering now, so I seem to be way more responsive now to what I'm eating than I used to be in this 2-year journey of mine, right? Yeah. Anyway, I think you're raising some really curious things. We're almost out of time, and I'm going to really be respectful of your day, because I know it's late in the afternoon there, and you want to probably get home and have your life now. You mentioned taking in 10 or 15 grams of carbs. Like, if I had potentially done that the day I was moving that load, or if I use that as a metaphor, on a day when I know I'm going to push really hard like that, what type of carbs do you think would be the choice? Like, what if I was to cube up some yams or sweet potato? Would you do it that way, or?
Yeah, I think I probably would. I think I'd probably go with something that's quite glucose heavy, so quite starchy, like a sweet potato or something like that. But you could also go the sucrose route, in the form of a fruit, or a bit of honey or something like that. But I think that the more reliable way would be to go the glucose way. So the potato, the sweet potato, or even, as much as I don't believe in grains, and I've got lots of problems with grains, you could even go for the more gentle grains, the nicer ones, like maybe oats or quinoa, or, if that's the way you want to do it, and try it and see if that improves your performance. And I would do it in 2 situations. I would do it, one, if you are finding that you're hitting a wall when you're low carbing. So you could be doing that, could be in performance, in races, in events, or it could even be in training. And I think you obviously want to try things out in training. And that could be once you've already been fat adapted for quite some time. But I think quite importantly, it might be for those athletes who are like, I don't want to go through 3 months of having my performance negatively impacted during the adaptation period. And so for them, they're still adapting. But if they get to an hour mark and they start finding that they can't train or their performance is impacted, then potentially they could try add in 10 to 15 grams of carbs in order to allow their exercise to still continue while their body is still fat adapting. And they will still fat adapt, because when you're exercising, you don't require insulin for the uptake of glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells. So you're basically, if you're going to be eating carbs and not let it interfere with your general metabolism most of the day, do it while you're exercising. And then you if you are fat adapting, if you're low carb or you're fat adapted, you're not going to need what the high carb athletes, the traditional athlete requirements say, which is like 50, 60 grams a day. An hour. You're not going to need that amount. Sorry. 50, 60 grams an hour. You're not going to need that amount. You're going to need maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 grams an hour after the first hour. And that's something that I find when I have clients who say that they're hitting a wall. I say, well, try this. See if it works. Do today's training with it and tomorrow's training without it. And let's see. And maybe it's something they can, if they're still in the early stages, it's something they can get off. They can lower it and get off it once they're fully fat adapted. Or maybe they're just physiologically that way inclined that they do better with it. Or maybe, especially with high intensity stuff, maybe they could do better with it if they're that way inclined. We don't really know enough about the individual variation, I think, at this stage. But I do know from anecdotal reports that a few people say that they do better after an hour of either intense exercise or 2 hours, 2.5 hours of endurance exercise when they introduce a bit of carbs. And some people they leave that for their events, so that they're kind of like they're waiting with that little like leftover arrow in their quiver, or whatever you want to call it. They're just, going to pull that one out when it really matters, but they'll train fat adapted, train without anything. And so it could just be something it's just something to consider and to play with, to be open-minded to playing with. And I think with keto and carnivore kind of spaces, paleo spaces, I think what's so exciting about these spaces is they're evidence-based. Right. We're not about being zealous or about being like, we don't believe in oats, we don't believe in carbs. It's like, okay, well, when you're exercising, in some people, that's going to be burnt during your exercise.
Right.
And maybe it could be something that could enhance performance in some people under some circumstances. And maybe it won't always be the case for that person. So I think we've got to keep an open mind and acknowledge what we don't know. Because I think when it comes to exercise, I find athletes are the ones who lead the way and the science follows. Whereas normally in other cases like diabetes and that, I think the science leads the way and the diabetics follow. I think, but athletes, for some reason, they're always there first. Maybe it's their competitive natures. But I think that we've got to look at anecdotal things, and where things don't add up, or where one person says, hey, but I've been ketoing, eating under 50 grams of carbs for 2 years, and I still hit a wall. Then take them seriously and try this approach. But other people like you, don't add the carbs. You clearly don't need them, Yeah. So I think, and again, when I say add carbs, I'm not talking huge amount of carbs. And I'm only talking when you've already, just before your high intensity thing, or when you've already been exercising for an hour, 2 hours, and you find that you're hitting a wall or your performance is impaired, then it's something to just consider.
You've almost left me speechless. We should finish up but there's a burning question. I have one last burning question if it'll come back to me. Or not so much a question as is a comment. I would be really excited about being part of a study that deals with the exact things that we're talking about for people that are my age, right? To look at the issue of the best types of movement for those of us at this age who are reversing diabetes or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
in regard to, the high intensity exercise, strength, and what I call the general movement, which is more of the endurance stuff. That would really be exciting. Sometimes I imagine myself sitting on a Volek table having muscle biopsies.
That'd be terrifying, but so awesome.
Yeah, to know. And I, and to piggyback on what you said, we are evidence based. What I care about is trying to understand our health and being healthy, based on real science, not
Correct.
the business. And you mentioned about the diabetics following the science, but with that said, we also know that there's this contrast between the epidemiological things that are out there, versus companies like Virta, who actually are looking at real values, real numbers, and saying things like about cardiovascular health and things like that. Maybe predominantly because this other side keeps pointing their fingers and saying, well, you keto people are going to be keeling over with heart attacks and strokes, and there's too much fat and all this business. But anyway,
If only the other side stopped towing the line and looked at the research, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Well, as you said, looking at the science and admitting, and that's the thing about you and I, and admitting when you don't know something and going, well, actually, we really don't know about that. There's anecdotal things, like I know my own experience that basically I can do my workouts every day, and it isn't like the old days in the carb world where for 3 days after a workout, I couldn't do anything, let alone hardly get out of bed.
Yeah, the recovery is much better, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, listen, Tamzyn, I would just like to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me this morning. This has been very educational for me, and I hope that our listeners have learned some things. I noticed that we did have a few comments coming in. One said, "Great information, very insightful for me as I am training for a marathon." So that's good. We have
Awesome.
some people. Yeah.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that what we spoke about can be helpful to people. And thank you so much for having me. It really has been such a privilege.
Give my regards to the rest of the crew there at the Nutrition Network. I really appreciate it.
I certainly will. Thanks,
all right,
Pete.
have a great evening.
Thank you. You have a good day.
Thank you again.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.